Greetings and salutations, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, dearest viewers. I come to you again to read yet another chapter of The Nazis and the Supernatural by Michael Fitzgerald. I say another chapter, I mean another part for chapter 3, A New Religion for Germany. So where we left off, the next section was the German Evangelical Church. We read about the Nazi crusade against the churches, the substitute religion that Nazism sought to become in order to fill the previous religious roles that the church, like the Christian church, had in Germany. So we pick up here at the German Evangelical Church. All right, let us begin. The German Evangelical Church was headed by the pro-Nazi bishop Ludwig Müller and was at first regarded as a means of unifying Protestants behind Hitler. It called for a people's church, with membership restricted to those of good German blood. Müller was an army chaplain, and his first action of becoming leader of German Protestantism was to speak in militaristic terms of Christian soldiers fighting a crusade against the forces of evil. He also introduced the Horst Wissel chant, "Banners up, close the ranks, free the streets for the brown battalions," into church ritual. When he preached, he wore his 2 iron crosses over his cassock, and he employed cavalry trumpeters to play military fanfares during his services. Müller and his supporters dismissed clergy with Jewish ancestors, and even those who were married to non-Aryans. They excluded from membership Jews who had converted to Christianity or whose ancestors had done so. The German Christians called for the Old Testament with its tales of cattle merchants and pimps to be abandoned completely and regarded as an entirely non-Christian book. Even the New Testament, in their eyes, needed revision to make Jesus' teachings conform entirely with the demands of National Socialism. They demanded that all church leaders should pledge full loyalty to Hitler and exclude converted Jews from their congregation. Their slogan became "One people, one Reich, one faith." The Nazis intended, or at least hoped, that the majority of Protestants in Germany would become part of Müller's church. That attempt was never successful, and most German Protestants remained within the mainstream Lutheran churches. The attack on the independence of the churches and the attempt to impose Nazi racial ideals upon them and make them an integral part of their doctrine actually roused fierce opposition. Rosenberg and positive Christianity. Rosenberg spoke glibly of what he called positive Christianity, which in essence meant a Christianity that was not only stripped of its Jewish heritage, but which also denied the essential Christian values and replaced them instead with a mishmash of racist and volkish ideas. He was too much of a remote intellectual to understand that such a concept could have never succeeded in gaining the loyalty and allegiance of genuine Christians. Rosenberg set up a program for a National Reich church during the early stages of the Second World War. His proposals were approved by Hitler and represented an attempt to suppress utterly the Christian religion in Germany. Had the war gone differently, Christianity would have faced a level of persecution it had not experienced since the time of the Roman Empire. It would have been replaced by Rosenberg's bizarre 30 articles, among which were: Number 5, the National Church is determined to exterminate irrevocably the strange and foreign Christian faiths imported into Germany. Number 13, the National Church demands immediate cessation of the publishing and dissemination of the Bible in Germany. Number 18, the National Church will clear away from its altars all crucifixes, Bibles, and pictures of saints. Number 19, on the altars there must be nothing but Mein Kampf to the German nation, and therefore to God, the most sacred book, and to the left of the altar, a sword. Number 30, on the day of its foundation, the Christian cross must be removed from all churches, cathedrals, and chapels, and it must be superseded by the only unconquerable symbol, the swastika. The German faith movement. Far more moderate than Rosenberg, Himmler, or even Mueller, Wilhelm Hauer was a scholar and expert on Indian culture, religion, and history. In 1933, he published a book that became the foundation document of the German Christians. Anti-Semitism was not one of the principal platforms of Hauer's book, and he stresses that Christianity is an irrelevant alien tradition rather than being directly opposed to Aryanism. The work is full of comparisons between Norse myth, Hindu mythology, philosophers like Plato and Hegel, mystics like Jacob Boehm and Meister Eckhart, and writers like Goethe, all thrown together in a scholarly but ultimately polemical manner for the freeing of the German people from Jewish influence. For Hauer, German culture has its own gospels, the ancient Norse and Teutonic myths. Wotan is the true god of the Germans and not the Christian god. German virtues are justice, nobility, and capacity for sacrifice, as opposed to the Christian ones like compassion. Hauer declared that the modern rejection of Christianity came from a new belief in the inviolability of the noble man's will, and he believed that it was the sole ground from which a genuine and adequate faith may arise. My apologies, I am stuttering a lot in this episode. My bad, guys. In his eyes, the rebirth of a German faith was imminent because Hitler and the Nazis had created a situation where it could become an historical reality. I think the author made a slight typographical error because that should be an A. H is not a vowel. Well, it's whatever. An historical reality. This bizarre but influential work attracted a highly favorable review from the psychologist Carl Jung, who announced that it cannot be read without profound emotion in Jung's eyes. There are representatives of the German faith movement who, both intellectually and in human terms, are fully in a position not merely to believe, but also to know that the God of the Germans is Wotan and not the universal God of the Christians. Hitler stands apart from the struggle. Hitler himself, on the whole, tried to stand apart from the struggle. Himmler and Rosenberg were the most vocally anti-Christian members of his cabinet, but Hess declared that atheists had modified the teachings of Christianity. Göring spoke of finding a way back to the primeval voices of our race, and von Schirach announced his intention to overcome Christianity. Count Reventlow told a crowd of 15,000 people that the ancient deities were still alive in the hearts of every German who was true to his or her blood and soil. In 1938, carols and nativity plays were banned in schools, and even the word Christmas was officially replaced by Yuletide. Catholic opposition to the Nazis. From the very beginning of the Nazi campaign against the churches, there was opposition. The Catholics refused to accept that Hitler possessed greater authority over them than the Pope, and the head of Catholic action was murdered by the Nazis. Following an agreement between the Vatican and Hitler, the worst excesses were toned down. Individual Catholic bishops and priests made brave and lonely protests, but the Church as a whole remained silent throughout the Nazi era. One of the few who spoke out was Cardinal Faulhaber, who met with Hitler on the 9th of November 1936 and condemned the racial laws and the sterilization program. Hitler lost his temper and informed Faulhaber that the Church had no business interfering in affairs of state and that he would not tolerate any such attempts. When 5 months later the papal encyclical Mit Brennender der Sorge was published and read from the pulpits of churches throughout Germany, Hitler exploded. Goebbels orchestrated a smear campaign against the churches in the media and also arrested hundreds of priests and nuns on charges of sexual immorality. They were quickly convicted and sent to the concentration camps. The confessional church resists the Nazis. Jehovah's Witnesses refused to serve in the armed forces or to cooperate with many other Nazi policies. They were arrested and held in concentration camps where many died. The majority of Protestant churches opposed the attacks on Christianity and often spoke out on specific issues, but on the whole, their opposition was muted. An honorable exception was Pastor Martin Niemöller, who was so hostile to the Arian Christianity of Müller's church that he founded a new religious organization, the Confessional Church. Niemöller was a complex and curious character, a former U-boat commander in the First World War, and a man who was politically an extreme nationalist and an ardent reactionary. He described the time of the Weimar Republic that preceded Hitler's rise to power as years of darkness, and actually joined the Nazi Party in the late 1920s. Niemöller welcomed Hitler's appointment as chancellor, declaring that it offered hope to Germany at last and would bring about a national revival. A less likely opponent of Nazism is difficult to imagine, and yet it was Niemöller who some 18 months later broke with the German Christians and set up his own church, declaring it to be the only legitimate Protestant church in Germany. On the 8th of November, 1934, Niemöller held a rally at Dahlem. Right, I read that right. Oh, Dahlem, my bad. A suburb of Berlin. 20,000 people attended to hear him and other confessional church leaders speak. The authorities had refused permission for the meeting to take place, but Niemöller and the crowd defied the ban. One speaker declared, "We are fighting against the defamation of the Church of Christ and true Christianity. There are false prophets abroad in this land, preaching the doctrine of blood and soil and racial mysticism, which we reject." A manifesto denounced and rejected Müller's German Christians, and the meeting ended with a defiant statement by Niemöller. "For us," he said, "it is a question of which master the German Protestants are going to serve, Christ or another." Everyone present knew that another referred to Hitler. This was the largest anti-Nazi rally ever held under the Third Reich. Shaken by an open rebellion shown at the meeting, the Gestapo began arresting pastors of the church. Niemöller was left alone for the time being, but from that moment onwards, the regime had him and his followers in their sights. Over the next 2 years, thousands of confessional church ministers were arrested, and the church had its funds seized and was forbidden to make collections from the congregation. In spite of these difficulties and the open persecution his church faced, Niemöller refused to abandon or even tone down his opposition to the Nazi attitudes. By now, Niemöller had moved from a defense of the independence of the churches and opposition to the anti-Christian propaganda of the regime to an outright condemnation of anti-Semitism. This brought more arrests and a counter-statement by Hans Carroll, who had replaced the incompetent Müller as head of the German Christians. Carroll declared, "The party stands on the basis of positive Christianity, and positive Christianity is National Socialism. National Socialism is the doing of God's will, and God's will reveals itself in the German blood." Responding to the claim that Christianity consists of faith in Christ as the Son of God, Carl scornfully replied, "That makes me laugh. True Christianity is represented by the party, and the German people are now called by the party, and especially by the Führer, to a real Christianity. The Führer is the herald of a new revelation." Similar statements were made by the mayor of Hamburg, who declared that "we can communicate directly to God through Hitler," by a group of German Christians who stated that Hitler's word is God's law, and by Baldur von Schirach, head of the Hitler Youth, who claimed, "The service of Germany appears to us to be genuine and sincere service of God. The banner of the Third Reich appears to us to be his banner, and the Führer of the people is the Savior whom he sent to rescue us." Niemöller would have no truck with such statements, which he understandably regarded as blasphemous. In a final show of public defiance on Sunday, the 27th of June, 1937, he preached his last sermon. The church was packed to the rafters with worshippers, and Niemöller, guessing that this would be his swan song, concluded his sermon with the defiant words, "We have no more thoughts of using our own powers to escape the authorities than had the apostles of God. No more are we ready to keep silent at man's behest when God commands us to speak, for it is and must remain the case that we must obey God rather than man." 3 days later, Niemöller was arrested and imprisoned. After 8 months of incarceration, he was transferred to Sachsenhausen concentration camp, where he remained for the next 7 years before being liberated by American troops. Another 800 leading ministers and members of the confessional church were also arrested and sent to the camps, where many of them died. The dangerous resistance to the regime shown by Niemöller and his followers was at an end. Anxious to preserve the remnants of the movement, a leading bishop issued a public statement that the National Socialism conception of life is the national and political teaching which determines and characterizes German mankind. As such, it is obligatory upon German Protestants also. The bishop also ordered his pastors to take a vow of allegiance and obedience to Hitler. By 1938, the Protestant resistance to the Nazis had been utterly crushed. Dietrich Bonhoeffer joins the German resistance. With the arrest and imprisonment of Niemöller, active defiance by German Protestants to Hitler virtually ceased. A notable exception was Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Generally considered one of the outstanding theologians of the 20th century, Bonhoeffer was in New York as war approached and could easily have remained there for the duration of the conflict. He was urged to do so by many of his friends and colleagues, but refused. Instead, he reluctantly made the brave decision to return to Germany. He explained to his colleague, the American theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, "Christians in Germany will face the terrible alternative of either willing the defeat." Let me restart. My bad. Christians in Germany will face the terrible alternative of either willing the defeat of their own nation in order that Christian civilization may survive, or willing the victory of their nation and thereby destroying Christian civilization. I know which of these alternatives I must choose. Bonhoeffer, along with his brother and brothers-in-law, became active in the German resistance to Hitler. He managed to survive until 1943, in spite of his increasing involvement in plots against the Führer. Possibly because his organization had been infiltrated by the SS, he certainly spoke on a I keep fumbling bad. Possibly his organization had been infiltrated by the SS because he certainly spoke on a visit to Sweden in 1942 about Himmler being in the process of launching a rebellion against Hitler. Whether this was deliberate disinformation by the SS, whether Himmler was at that early stage was considered a coup, he certainly did so at a later stage of the war, or whether it was a simple misunderstanding of his intentions, the result was the same. Bonhoeffer was arrested and sent to Buchenwald. In April of 1945, he was executed, as were his brother and brothers-in-law. It was a sad end to the life of a brave, brilliant, and utterly principled man. And we are going to pause there. We are almost done with Chapter 3, and soon we will continue on to Chapter 4, the New Teutonic Knights. My apologies for fumbling so much. I don't have any Arizona with me today, so I can't really wash down anything, But I'll see you all in the next episode. Take care. Have a good rest of your day. Like and subscribe if you so choose. And see you around. Bye.